Hello everybody, it's 12 o'clock Eastern and it's Tuesday, so it's another IAEI News Live. Welcome to this session of IAEI News Live. It is a recorded session. Today I'm in meetings at this time and I wasn't sure if I'd be able to go live, so I decided to record this session, but next week we will be live and for another great topic, I'm sure. All right, so today's discussion, today on IAEI News Live, we are going to talk about that portion of the code which to many installations we go dumpster diving for, and it's like I call it the instructions for the code. It's Article 90, Introduction, and it all starts now. All right, so Article 90. I hope everybody out there is doing well. I'm sure we've got, get the chats going. If you've got questions, remember, you can go out to IAEI's YouTube site and view any of the past IAEI News Lives and comment on them, ask questions about them, so please engage with those. This cycle, or this cycle, I'm still in 2026 code cycle mode. We've got a lot going on with the 2026 code, so if you're not familiar with that, man, get engaged, because there's a lot going on in the National Electrical Code these days. A lot of change, a lot of opportunities to make things a little bit more user-friendly, I would argue. So we got a lot going on. So anyway, Article 90. I call it the instructions for the code for a few different reasons. You would probably reference and say, look, you know, most of the requirements are not in Article 90. The requirements aren't in Article 100. That's just terminology. And you might go straight to Article 110 and start reading the book. And you know what? That's fine. I mean, as long as you're reading the book, right? But the key thing to remember is Article 90 has a lot of very important information, and it has seen changes throughout the years. And I'm telling you, Article 90 is going to probably see more changes moving forward for a few different very important reasons, which we will talk about. So what Article 90's title is, the introduction. And let's do this. I'm gonna go back in time. This is unplanned. This is spur of the moment, just as if I was live. I'm gonna grab a few old code books, and man, I've got a few old code books all the way back to, now this is not an original 1897 edition of the code book. A gentleman gave this to me, and a very good friend. And I'm going to look and see, did the very first... All right, so you'll love this. These rules and requirements are adopted by the Underwriters Association of the Middle Department and are applicable to the electric light, power, and heating work within its jurisdiction. The association reserves the right to, at any time, add to change or otherwise modify these rules, blah, 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 blah. General suggestions. As a general rule, in all electrical work, conductors, however well insulated, should always be treated as bare, to the end that under no conditions, existing or likely to exist, can a grounding or short circuit occur and so that all leakage from conductor to conductor or between conductor and ground may be reduced to the minimum. These are general suggestions. All right, so that begins with general suggestions. I'm looking for is there, and there was no. So you had the beginning was Class A, stations and dynamo rooms. You had a general suggestions. Wiring and apparatus, light, heat. So this is superseding all previous rules. It didn't say, it didn't have like a national electrical code. You had Class B, outside work. You had Class C, inside work. So there was no, and this was written, and then you had high potential systems. So there was no real, like, format that you would expect, that you like what you see today. Now I'm going to go to my oldest code book. Well, wait a second. You know what? I think I'm going to go to my oldest code book, 1923, 53, 47, 65. I think 1923 is my oldest book. Electric light and power equipments, consisting of the National Electrical Code. All right, I don't want it to focus on me. And inspection department. All right, so with explanatory notes, you had a preface. Well, somebody fixed this one. They did a good job too. The cover wasn't off, but they reattached. All right, let's just take a look. You got stockroom. The rules in brief. So in the beginning, it had the rules in brief. You had contracts, generators, motors. I love it. The rules in brief. There's Article 1 definition. There was no Article 90 in the 23 code. You went to definitions, and then you went to Article 2, which is general. And I would say that's like 110, Article 110. You had services. All right, so there was no Article 90 in the 2023 edition. Let's fast forward to 53. 1953, let's take a look at 53. There was, we have an Article 230, so we got numbering. You got a 110, you've got a 100, and there was an introduction. Now the introduction, it says the first nationally recommended electric code was published by the National Board of Fire Underwriters in 1895. 1895. And this says 1897. So this, with this code as the basis, the National Code was drawn in 1897. All right. Okay. So I got. As the result of the united efforts, blah, 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 the various insurance, electrical, architectural. So there's your sort of overview. Then you have the introduction. You have, in 1953, so somewhere probably before 1953, I'm not going to go hunting and pecking. It had a purpose and scope. And the National Electrical Code today has a scope statement. 90.1 is the scope. And that's new for the 2023 edition because previous editions of the NEC 90.1, I'm going to go to the 20, I can always tell my 2020 code book because it's got no spine. It has no, my code book has no spine. 90.1 in the last cycle was purpose, and it was not scope. And the style manual, which is another very important document, which we could probably do a whole session on, the style manual requires that .1 be scope. So in the 2023 edition, they changed 90.1 from purpose to scope and purpose. I'm going to see. Yeah, there is no, the code no longer has a purpose. 90.1. We could run with that one. Willie, I know you're going to run with that one. 90.2 talks about use and application in the 2023 code. And I think so what they did was they changed the title. What used to be 90.1 purpose, they now call it use and application. And they've separated that into various first level subdivisions. First one being practical safeguarding. And if you look at the 2020 code, 90.1 purpose, A was practical safeguarding. Then you had adequacy. And then we have installations covered. So they took what used to be in the scope, which was installations, what's covered and what's not covered, and they moved that into this new 90.2 called use and application. So you have installations covered and not covered. And then you had relation to other international standards. But what I'm curious, and I've not read the 1953 edition of what wasn't labeled as Article 90, but was called Introduction. The purpose and scope, it says the purpose of this code is the practical safeguarding of persons and of buildings and their contents from hazards arising from the use of electricity for light, heat, power, radio, signaling, and for other purposes. It covers the electric conductors and equipment installed within or on public and private buildings and other premises, including yards, carnival and parking lots, and industrial substations. Also, the conductors that connect the installations to a supply of electricity and other outside conductors adjacent to the premises. So that's the first paragraph in this. I know, Jody, it's Christmas. I've got my IAEI's coffee cup over there, but I was upstairs and I got my coffee this morning, and Bobby Joe gave me my Christmas coffee cup because we are in the Christmas season. I have to get a Christmas edition IAEI coffee cup. Anyway, it does now. So that's the first paragraph. Now the purpose. Now that's purpose and scope. Now, Article 90, the introduction in the 2023 edition. I'm going to try something, and I don't know if it's going to work. Yay, it worked. All right, so this is out of our IAEI's 2023 code change PowerPoint presentation. Now, let me help you understand something. So once you buy the PowerPoint slide deck, keep in mind that leaders in the industry are using this, and we get emails saying, hey, I don't know, maybe we missed or we didn't include something, or maybe the slides can be improved for any reason. I mean, we've gotten some comments just aesthetically. Didn't change the technical content, but we changed some of the visuals. And we've modified, and we've added some slides, because as you deliver these slide decks and you're educating and you're trying to help people understand, you'll get questions and you'll look back at the slide and you'll go, you know, we probably could add something to the slide deck to make it to answer some of these questions, common questions that we're getting. So the slide deck has seen some revisions and has gotten out to those who have purchased those. So those who have purchased a copy of the slide decks should have gotten an email from Jody Wages about an update. So because we have made some modifications, and we try to keep all of those out there who are the educators who are using this slide deck, who've purchased the slide deck, up to date. So now I just wanted to at least say that. But in any case, Article 90 is your introduction. This is the 2023. This is out of the 2023 code book. Now, they made some changes in 2023. 90.1 was 1, right? So they added a scope. They also changed the 90.5, which is your mandatory rules. So remember, 90.1 scope, 90.2 is use and application. So they reorganized that. 90.3 is your code arrangement, which we're gonna talk about that in a second. But I want to look at 2023 changes, mandatory rules, explanatory materials, and what we try to do is we try to, in the slide deck, cover the things that are significant. In some cases, like in Article 90, reorganizing things, the requirements or the content didn't change. It was just put into a different location. So we may not include that in a presentation material because we want to capture as we want to make your time with the code changes very efficient. That's the word I'm looking for. So usually when I'm live, I can look at the chat and you guys and gals out there will fill in the words for me, but I don't have the luxury of that, and it is early. So explanatory materials such as references to other standards, etc., etc. It says, or annex, unless the standard reference includes a date, the reference is to be considered as the latest edition of the standard. Now, this is going to change again in the 2023. So when you see a document that is referenced in the code in the 2023 edition, and I would argue it wasn't probably consistent in previous editions. It was probably, here we go. So it was probably not as consistent, and we're trying to get more consistent, but we're going to change the consistency next cycle because the style manual changed in this regard. But there's always been this debate in the in amongst code panel members and in the industry. Various individuals who are heavy users of the code book will see a reference in an informational note to say an IEEE document or some other document. Some of the references will include a date and some of them will not. And every code panel, I think, has sort of their own recipe or their own thought process or position. I'm not sure how I would explain it. Some code panels I have seen, I'm just going on my opinion. Okay, stop, cut, editing. Make sure you cut this stuff out. Everything I say sometimes starts up here. Every now and then it'll start down here and then migrate up to the brain. So, but I try to start here, make sure it comes out here, and it's all from the heart and my experience. I do not speak on behalf of NFPA, IAEI, Eaton, NEMA, any manufacturer, anybody else, other than this guy. It's my opinion, okay? So what I share with you is my opinion, and yours may differ. And if it does, use the chat. I want to hear if you disagree, you agree. Question everything you hear and even more of what you see, please. All right? So, having said that, oh, and I think I turned off, I did, look at that. No automatic emojis. Before, if I did this, it was sparks and everything. And if I did that, I would get this thumbs up thing that would pop up. I got rid of that. I figured out how to turn it off. It's a setting. So every code panel, what I've seen is some code panels would say, look, if we don't care what the edition of the document is that I'm referencing, because I'm not referencing a specific paragraph or a line item that may change, and I'm just saying, like, for example, if you want surge information, go see IEEE standard blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to worry about the edition because the standard is on surge, and I don't care what the contents are. All I'm saying is if you want information on surge, go see this document. It's one good industry reference. I don't need an edition or a date on it because it doesn't matter. So some code panels take that position. Other code panels say, well, no, I want the specific edition number. Maybe it, even if it's just a generic reference, they still want the edition number. They had that freedom in the past. There were no hard, fast rules in Article 90 that said, this is how you do. Now there are. Now, in the 2023 edition, what they settled on was they said, look, if you don't see a date, it's whatever is the latest edition, because there was the other issue. And I don't know why. I'm sure there are examples, and you may have examples of where you have a individual who would say, and there would be a reason to say that, look, the edition of the code is the 2023, and the edition of that document at the time the code was written was the 2020 edition. There was a new edition in 2024, but you can't reference that edition because that wasn't available when the code was written. And that sort of implies that the panel members read the document, right? But panel members don't read these documents. Maybe there's a person at the table who was involved with the revision of whatever document it is. But in some of these, like IEEE references and things like that, you have to purchase them. And code panel members aren't going to be, donating their time to go through the processes of reviewing public inputs, and then, oh, by the way, I've got to buy this booklet, this IEEE document or whatever document, and read it to say, does it really apply? So, and that's just a big debate just in informational notes in general. Just my opinion, and I've heard these discussions and debates on, should we reference these documents? I've heard people argue at the table, how can we put a reference to a document if we've never read it? Yeah, the title says surge, or the title says fault current calculations. But have you read it? What does it say? Do you agree with it? Or do you not agree with it? So in any case, those debates and those arguments have occurred over time. And suffice it to say, we have some rules as part of the style manual that was in effect for the 2023 edition, which basically says, look, if the reference does not have a date in the code, then it's the latest edition of that document. If the reference has a date, then that's the specific document that we need to reference. Now, when we first made this change in the 2023 code cycle, I'm going to tell you how I explained this. And I thought it really made a lot of sense to me. But I'll argue that it's wrong because the style manual changed. But I'll tell you where my head was at when I tried to understand this change. My thinking was, what you see here, when you look through the code book, none of the UL standards have a date. And you say, well, why? Well, because we want the product listed to the latest edition of the standard, not whatever was in published at the time. Okay? So what I always tell people is I would say, look, you know, one of the reasons they did this was because, especially, and I'd focus in on these standards because we want products installed that have the latest edition of the standard. You don't want to, if my state was on the 2020 or 2017 edition of the National Electrical Code, and the UL standard for, say, I don't know, panel boards was, instead of 2017, say it was 2016, right? I wouldn't want you to go, oh, well, here in 2023, now we're in 2023, I need to find a panel board that was listed to a standard back in 2017. Because the standards are going to change to keep up with the latest editions of the code book, and you probably aren't going to, well, I know you're not going to be able to find, say, a panel board with 6 disconnects in it for the 6 disconnect rule listed as service entrance equipment, because the latest edition of the code says, hey, you can't do that no more. And oh, by the way, I'm going to ship you booties for the line side breakers on the mains, and you know, even though the older editions of the code didn't require it and the standards didn't require, well, I think the standards have changed now. I was going to say now, but the standards have changed to accommodate those barriers, and you're going to have those. So you would still want to install the latest product listed to these standards that have changed. So in any case, because there are rules. I mean, as a manufacturer, they can't ship a product to an old edition of the standard saying, hey, you know, this jurisdiction is on the 17 code, so I'm going to ignore all of these new requirements in the standards and I'm going to go back to the 17 edition. You all wouldn't let you ship it, right? So that's how I used to explain it. But here's where, it made perfect sense to me, because, you know, sometimes we try to fit our rhetoric to the change. And that, honestly, that can be a bad thing. It takes a certain eye to put, remember, you got to look at these documents like a legal document, which they, in many cases, they're adopted into law, so they are a legal document. So you have to really look at the language and forget about the dialogue around that. Now, I know in some cases it really irritates the crap out of me, because in some cases the language, if you read it verbatim, it's like, well, that's not what we meant. Well, that's what you wrote. Okay? And you go, well, yeah, but, and you try to, you know, worm your way around that. But because the language wasn't written very clear. But in many cases, you've got to put put the influence of the change aside and read the change. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm giving you an example of my personal experience in this regard with this change. When I saw this is how I explained it. And I came up with a reason that I thought made sense based upon what the change that was made. But in reality, and I had one of those aha moments in this, these reference documents are not in positive text. They're not a requirement. So I would talk to people like, hey, these are if I'm referencing a specific standard edition in this informational note, then, you know, people are going to say, well, that's what you're required to use. And you know what? That might happen. It probably will happen. And we'll have to have this discussion. I know we will, because I've had it in similar areas. And that was my aha moment. When I saw the style manual change, I scratched my head a little bit. And I'm like, wait a second, I hate this. I hate when you go through this effort to teach one thing, and now we're going to change it. And we're doing this on a couple areas. But this one here, I would argue, I would tend to agree with, I guess. Because here's my argument or my discussion to support what we did in the 2023 cycle was what I just said, right? Hey, I want to use the latest standard. I don't want to use an older standard. But in an informational note, it is just that, information only. I could make, I think, a very valid argument that the date doesn't matter in any case because it is information only. It's not a requirement. But the style manual gods have declared for the next edition of the code that every reference, standard, or document that you're going to find in an informational note, because you can't put it in positive text because you can't require it. There's only one place, and it's in article, I think it's in 90 or 110. I think it's in 110. But in any case, every one of these is going to have a date of the published edition at the time of the code panel meetings, right? So as you're reviewing this, if, in this case here, we've got a UL standard, and it's the UL standard for 4703, standard for PV wire and UL 3003 distributed generation cables for DG cable. So there's no date, and in the 2023 edition, that's, hey, use the latest. But it's an informational note. So in any case, some of these examples are important not from the exact change and the impact of it, but how we use the code. So the message here is that's an informational note. It's not enforceable. The date, in my opinion, doesn't matter. Whether it says the edition that at the time that the code was being published, or if there's no date there, in my opinion, it doesn't matter. It's an informational note. It's for information only. Now, the style manual for the 2026 edition and moving on is going to require dates on all of these documents, which could be good information, because at least you'll know, hey, if you go out and you look for that UL standard, and let's say that UL standard's date was, 1996, and then you go out to the UL site and you find that, oh wow, that standard's been updated in 2028, and you're on the 2026 code. Well, great, you learned something, and it's a reference. You don't have to now. You may look through that document and go, I don't see anything in here that pertains to this section in the code. And if you go find an older edition of that document, that reference document, you may find there was content in there that was pertinent to that section of the code. And that is when you have a public input to say, this no longer has any bearing on this section of the code. So there is some rhyme and reason to it. So that was one of the changes in the 2023 code cycle. That was the change. Well, I would say that was probably the most significant change. If I look down through, we reorganized. So let's just go back to the current scope is very similar to that 1956. I'm going to look at the 65 code. Does the 65 code, has, drum roll please, it has an Article 100 and an Article 90, and it has a purpose. Now, it says, the scope, 90.1, is not the scope of the code. Remember, the .1s have the scope of the article, okay? So the scope of Article 90 is the use and application, arrangement, and enforcement of the code. It covers the expression of mandatory, permissive, and non-mandatory text, provides guidance on the examination of equipment and on wiring, planning, and specifies the use and expression of measurements. Make sense? That's 90.1. Use and application. Now, 90.2 is the use and application. This is sort of what we called the, what did we call this before? We called this, I think it was purpose. If I'm not mistaken, it was purpose. And it was, it was purpose in 1965. Let's go back to that 50s edition. We were in the 53 edition. Let's see, we said there was it wasn't called Article 90 in 1953, if I'm not mistaken. It was Introduction. Purpose and scope, wiring layout. So it was purpose and scope. And so then they split at some point purpose and scope out. 90.1 was purpose, and then 90.2 became scope. But, and they had the purpose of this code. So practical safeguarding, the purpose of this code is the practical safeguarding of persons and the buildings. It now says, in the 2023 edition, the purpose of this code is the practical safeguarding of persons and property from hazards arising. And now that's an important piece right there. Here's what, and I don't know why stuff irritates me sometimes, but it does. Okay, I will hear people say, the only things we put in the code are those requirements that are life safety related. And that is not true. It's not true, right? We want to protect property as well. Surge is a very good example of this, although there were people in the discussion of the surge requirements that kept saying we have to tie this to life safety, and you don't have to tie it to life safety. The purpose of the code is to protect persons and property. So if I have a condition, if electricity could burn down facilities, can take out billions of dollars worth of electrical equipment and not kill a soul and not hurt one individual, that is a reason for a code change. It does not always have to be tied to death and dismemberment. The rubberneckers of the world, you know, always wanting to look at the accident. If you can protect the property, that is a valid substantiation. So, and if you look at various requirements in the code, overcurrent protection on a conductor, not every conductor that burns up is going to kill somebody, but we still protect conductors. Right? We don't look at an application and say, well, you know, this is in an area that nobody will ever go to, and if it all burns up, so what? No, we care about that. The only thing we don't do, the only area that we give some forgiveness is what? What article would you argue? What article would you argue that you don't care if it burns up doing its job? Put it in the chat. I'm not going to tell you where my head's at. I'd love to know where your head's at. Put it in the chat. What article, what piece of equipment in a structure, I'm not going to say what type of structure, do you think that we don't care if it goes to failure doing its job? All right. So we got practical safeguarding. We have adequacy. Now, this is another good one. I'm looking at the 2023 code book. This code contains provisions that are considered necessary for safety. Compliance therewith and proper maintenance result in an installation that is essentially free from hazard, but not necessarily efficient, convenient, or adequate for good service or future expansion of electrical use. Now you're going to go, hold on, Tom. You just said in A, when we talked about the purpose. You said, look, practical safeguarding of persons and property. And then in adequacy, the first sentence says, this code contains provisions that are considered necessary for safety. And that's a true statement. Even if there are provisions in the code that just are there for property protection, that is still an accurate sentence. Because it doesn't say, this code contains only provisions that are considered necessary for safety. It says this code contains provisions that are considered necessary for safety, and that is true. Compliance therewith. So, I go to this when I talk to some design engineers who open the code book immediately. They'll say, I'm going to do a design on a commercial building. I'm going to design a residential dwelling unit. What does the code say? The code is not a design guide. Where's that at? Where is that? That is in, where is it at? Hold on. I know there's design. 90.2a. There it is. 90.2a. I read it. In A. This code is not intended as a design specification or an instruction manual for untrained person. My issue is, when we design power distribution systems, dwelling units are a good example. Who do you need to satisfy? If you're the electrician, you're the electrical designer, you're the whatever. You're going to lay out the electrical system for a residential dwelling unit. You don't have to satisfy the code only. You don't go to the code and say, what are my minimum requirements? We go above and beyond the code every day in every house. If you did the calculation for exactly the minimum number of circuits that are required for a dwelling unit, you would laugh. Because it would not be any, we wouldn't need 42 circuit panels. We wouldn't have needed to remove the restriction on number of circuit breakers that are permitted in a panel board. We would not have needed to do that. If you only designed a structure, especially a dwelling unit home, to the minimum number of circuits. We go above and beyond. And that's okay, because the code, the number of circuits, that minimum is not required. It's the minimum. And you've exceeded the code if you've got more than that basic number of circuits. Probably because of what we just read in adequacy. Free from hazard, but not necessarily efficient, convenient, or adequate. Think about that. Think about what 90.2b says in the National Electrical Code. You design to these requirements and it may not be adequate for good service or future expansion of electrical use. It's not adequate for good service yet. This code contains provisions that are considered necessary for safety, yet it may not be adequate for good service. 90.2b, in my opinion, is like drinking a cup of coffee. It's like getting slapped in the face. It's like jumping into a cold shower or a cold swimming pool. Because it's a wake-up message that, look, you need to focus your energy on meeting your customers' wants and needs. What does your homeowner want? What does your plant manager need? What does your plant manager want and desire? Does your plant manager need to make sure that their system is reliable? Overall, for production purposes, not having anything to do with life safety. Those are going to go, when you have those types of systems, you're going to go above and beyond what's in the National Electrical Code. So the process is, number one, understand what your customers want and wants and needs are. Number two, you design a system to meet those wants and needs, and you document it very well. And then number three, you make sure you didn't violate the National Electrical Code. That's why your plans are very important. That's why an inspector is going to look at your plans. They're going to take that document and they're going to go, all right, Tommy D, he has a house, he's got a residential dwelling unit, and he's putting a generator. Oh, wow. He's putting a automatic transfer switch and he's powering the entire home. That's not required in Article 700. It's not required in Article 702. For a dwelling unit, it's not required in 701. This isn't a critical operation power system, it's Article 708. You could say, hey, you can't do that. Well, no, you can. Why? Because the homeowner probably wanted his entire house or her entire house backed up on a generator. Oh, by the way, you put photovoltaics on the roof and you've got an energy storage system outside. Hey! It's not required by the code. It's not required by the building code. He put a garage on his house. It's not even required as the part of the building code to have a garage. The fact that I have a basement, I'm in a basement. It's not required as part of the building code to have a basement. Think about this. Minimum requirements. Go to your building code. Does your building code require you to have a basement in your house and a garage? Can you build a home that's built on a slab and doesn't have a garage? You sure can, right? You don't need to put in a pool either. You're going to need a kitchen because you can't call it a dwelling unit. Look at the definition of a dwelling unit. So there are provisions that we do inside of a house. My point is, don't use the code as your design guide. Article 90 is a slap in the face to wake you up and say, look, if I designed this, it may not be efficient, convenient, or adequate for good service or future expansion, right? So if I buy equipment, I put a large transformer, I install larger transformers than what the load needs. I install panel boards, larger in capacity than what the load demands and higher in short circuit current ratings, right? I may say this panel board needs to be 65K and it needs to be a 600 amp panel board. And you go, well, you don't have 600 amps on there and your available fault current's only 5,000 amps. Why do you need 65K? We're going to bump that down. No, that's the design. The drawings say 65K. I want a 65K panel board there. There was probably a reason, because the minimum requirements of the code may not be convenient or adequate for good service or future expansion. And it could be that this facility is going to see growth, and the design engineer knows it. The owner knows it. The investors know it. And they want to build an infrastructure that is prepared for the growth. So it's important. It's important that we maintain per the drawings and enforce that. So when I talk to design engineers, I try to help them understand. Don't go running to the code. You go running to your customer, you talk to your architects, you understand your customer wants and needs, period. Second, you design to meet those customer wants and needs, period. Third, you make sure you didn't violate the National Electrical Code. So you need two professionals looking at your system. The first professional understands how to design systems to meet customer wants and needs. It's going to be your design professional, your design engineer, I say design professional, right? You don't need to have a PE license, etc. I'm staying away from all that discussion, that debate. You just need to be qualified to be able to design a system to meet your customers' wants and needs, and you got to know what those wants and needs are to begin with. Then you need someone who understands this. You need someone who understands this book. Because if you don't understand this, you can't make sure that you didn't violate this. And I would argue it's not just this. It's whatever your state or your jurisdiction adopted. And it might not even be your jurisdiction, right? You may live and operate and function in Weirton, West by God, Virginia, but your design and your structure is being built in Massachusetts. Do I need to know Weirton, West by God, Virginia code? No. I need to know what are the rules and regulations in Massachusetts, which may incorporate a lot of what's in here and maybe all of what's in here and plus more, or may have modified what's in this book. So I need to understand the local jurisdiction requirements. Value, IAEI. It's the value of being IAEI members and having access to all of your relationships across the country. I can't tell you how often I've leveraged my relationships that I have built through my association with the IAEI. It's too long to say. All right, I know I'm going to butcher it. So IAEI is the value it has brought me and my career are those relationships, so I can understand what jurisdictions are enforcing and employing and how different design engineers are addressing those needs. So adequacy is very important. And it's very important to understand what is covered and what's not covered. One of the big areas, and it's not just the only area, but the utility installations. That line of demarcation between what the customer owns and what the utility owns is critically important because it helps you understand what do you need to enforce and follow the NEC with, and what is covered by the NESC, the National Electrical Safety Code, which covers the utility stuff. Because if you look at what's not covered, installations under the exclusive control of an electric utility, where such installations, A, consist of service drops, service laterals, and associated metering, or are on property owned or leased by the electric utility for the purpose of communications, metering, etc. Read 90.2D, installations not covered, and understand where you're not following the National Electrical Code. And here's a big, I think, one of the areas that I have seen, medium voltage, that I have seen where we are ignoring the requirements in the National Electrical Code. I've done a few educational programs on medium voltage, or on code changes, and I talk about the changes in the 2023 code cycle around medium voltage. And I ask people, I say, who in here deals with medium voltage? And all these hands go up. And I say, who in here works on medium voltage pertaining to utilities? And none of the hands go up. And I go, okay, so you're all following the rules in the National Electrical Code. And they go, no, we're not. We follow the NESC. And I go, well, why? The NESC doesn't apply. This is your governing document because it's customer-owned medium voltage applications. And then they scratch their head and they want to argue and discuss it further. And it becomes a long discussion because they didn't realize that the NEC pertained. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's ridiculous, Tom. I've never had that before. But fine, I'm just telling you in my classes, in some of my classes, not all of them, in some, I've had a lot of people who didn't understand that fact. And then they get really interested in the document in the National Electrical Code and what are the requirements in there and how do they differ from the NESC. There are differences. All right, so installations not covered is in 90.2. Now, here is, I think, if I may be mistaken, but I believe this is the only reference to an actual standard in positive language. In 90.2e, relation to other international standards, it says the requirements in this code address the fundamental principles of protection for safety contained in section 131 of International Electrotechnical Commission Standard 60364-1, Low Voltage Electrical Installations, Part 1, Fundamental Principles, Assessment of General Characteristics, Definitions. That's in positive text. And then there's an informational note that says C, IEC 60364-1, which is right there in the positive text, for fundamental principles of protection for safety that encompass protection against electric shock, protection against thermal effects, protection against overcurrent, protection against fault currents, and protection against overvoltage. All of these potential hazards are addressed by the requirements in this code. That is a positive text reference to a third party outside standard, an IEC standard. It's not in an informational note. It is in 90.2e. Interesting. Special permission, the authority, the AHJ for enforcing this code may grant exception. So this is a 90.2f, which used to be 90, was it 90.3f? No, not 90.3f, 90.6? .5 special permission. I'm trying to look at this without my glasses. And you know what happens? Everything gets blurry. Ooh, wow, it just got all clear. There was a 90.4 enforcement. That's still there. Where is that provision? There's 90.6 formal interpretations. That is still there. I could have swore it was not, it was a C. It was 90.2C? Special permission? Yeah, it was 90.2C. I don't know why I was thinking 90.3C. It was 90.2C. The AHJ, and then the language is the same. It's just a different location. It's 90.2F now. The AHJ for enforcing this code may grant exception for the installation of conductors and equipment that are not under the exclusive control of the electric utilities and are used to connect the electric utility supply system to the service conductors of the premises served, provided such installations are outside a building or structure or terminate inside at a readily accessible location. So this is your special permission for connecting into services. Then you have the code arrangement, and I'm going to end on a code arrangement. The code arrangement has seen some love since the 17 edition. Yep. So if you looked, remember the change in the 2017 edition, there was a realization. Remember what it used to say? It said chapters 1 through 4 apply generally, and 5 through 7 can supplement or modify chapter 1 through 4. But they realized that there were requirements that were in, there were areas in chapters 5 through 7, maybe in chapter 6, wherever, that supplemented and modified. Like say there was something in hazardous locations, chapter 5, that may modify what's in chapter 7, say, I don't know, or chapter 7 may modify what's in chapter 5 for hazardous locations, say marinas or something like that. I don't know if that was a fact, but I'm just picking an example. So they said, wait a second, there were things that could modify each other outside of this 90.3 rule, that 1 through 4 are general and only 5, 6, and 7 can modify chapters 1 through 4. So they made a change that said chapters 1 through 4 are indeed general requirements. They apply to all electrical installations. 5, 6, and 7 and 1 through 4, 5, 6, and 7 can modify, not and, 5, 6, and 7 can modify chapters 1 through 7. So you can have something in chapter 6 that modifies requirements in chapter 7 or 5, etc., etc., etc. All right. So now chapter 8 is standalone. It's not subject to the requirements of 1 through 7 unless you specifically call it out. And then you have chapter 9, which is your tables. They're applicable as referenced. And then your informative annexes are just that, information only. So that was an important change that we saw in the 2017 edition. In the 2020 code, 2020 code did not change that, but the 2020 code did change. They did have changes to the scope. Now, here was what was going on in the 2020 code. Remember, we made a bunch of changes in 2 locations. Article 555 for marinas. And then we had another issue with electric vehicle charging equipment. We had another issue, and maybe did that happen in the 2023 or the 2020? Hold on. Yes, that's right. In 90.2a, it was section 5 and 6. So here was the issue. Remember, we have two instances. You have electric vehicles and you have boats. In marina applications, there's documented cases of modifications that are done to boats electrically that caused deaths. Now, the National Electrical Code does not apply to the wiring on the boat. The National Electrical Code does not apply to the wiring in a vehicle. I don't care if it's an electric vehicle or a gas-powered vehicle. We don't apply the National Electrical Code to the wiring harness and the wiring inside of a vehicle between the battery, the alternator, all of the windows and the receptacles, right? The receptacles are there. So back in chapter 6, we had some requirements that drifted over to say the receptacles on an electric vehicle had to have GFCI protection. The automotive industry was like, wait a second. You know, they put a receptacle in the back seat. They put a receptacle in the front seat. They have a receptacle in trucks in the bed. And what do they use those for? Powering tools. But the NEC doesn't apply to those receptacles. So they tried to clarify the scope in 5 and 6 to address the boats and the electric vehicles. Now in 90.2a, which is what's covered in 5, they said installations supplying shore power to ships and watercraft in marinas and boatyards, including monitoring of leakage current. They can't say that within the scope is the installation of electrical equipment on ships and watercraft in marinas and boatyards. They can say that if you are supplying shore power, it's covering. This covers that equipment. On electric vehicles, the scope in 90.2a6 says installations used to export electric power from the vehicle to the premises wiring or for bidirectional current flow are covered under the code. And in chapter 6, it's 625. Is it 625? Yeah, it is. It's 625. I'll tell you the change that drove that one. Let me show you something. 625. 625 is electric vehicle power transfer system. There was past, wait a second, I'm in the 20, yeah, I think it was the 2020 code. I'm almost positive, it may have been the 17. But I'm going to look for the requirement. The output cables, portable equipment, interconnected, personal protection system. The equipment shall have a listed blah, 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 blah. Portable equipment, loss, 625 ventilation, 625 supply circuits. There it is. AC 625.60. AC receptacles installed in electric vehicles and intended to allow for connection of off-board utilization equipment shall comply with 625.60A through D. A says the receptacle outlet shall be listed. B, the receptacle outlet shall be rated 250 volts maximum, single phase, 50 amperes maximum. And C, overcurrent protection. Electric vehicles provided with receptacle outlets for power export shall be provided with overcurrent protection integral to the power export system. The overcurrent protection shall have a nominal rating sufficient for the receptacle it protects. The overcurrent protection shall also be sufficiently rated for the maximum available fault current, etc. And then D, this was the kicker. Ground fault circuit interrupter protection for personnel shall be provided for all receptacles. The ground fault circuit interrupter indication and reset shall be installed in a readily accessible location. That is what got the automotive industry pretty upset and nervous, because it says all receptacles. And it's only electric vehicles, right? So I would say, you know, there are receptacles on trucks that are gas and diesel, but this is only on electric vehicles because the focus was the export to the structure. The NEC does not, you're not going to have an electrical inspector come to the house and say, hey, I need to see that pickup truck because I'm going to check the receptacles in the bed of that truck to see if they're all GFCIs. Ain't going to happen. It's just not, it's not addressed by the NEC. It's outside of the scope. The receptacles that are in that vehicle, in the back seat, in the bed of the truck, I don't care if it's electric or not, they're a part of the standards for building the vehicle. But the moment you start to export, that's when we from an electrical perspective, we start to understand there's a connection point here to the structure. We need to make sure we have it covered with what we need for the installation and that interaction with the structure. So they had to change the scope to address what is and isn't covered under these two scenarios, because we started to creep into that line of moving onto a vessel or onto a vehicle. So they added clarity in the scope. All right. I can't talk about Article 90 anymore. This is, it's been fun. It's been real. And I can say it has been real fun. So you hopefully should have a different perspective. Maybe you have the same perspective of Article 90 that you had before this short session on Article 90. But the requirements that are found in Article 90, the scope, the use and the application, enforcement, the code arrangement, mandatory rules, permissive rules, explanatory material, formal interpretations, examination of equipment for safety, wiring, planning, and units of measurement. It's only got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 sections. Read them, please, and understand what Article 90 has to offer in your proper application of this book, and this book, and this book, and this book. Doesn't matter the edition. Understand the introduction to the book that you're applying. It could help you navigate the document better. It can help you enforce the document better. It may even help you with your arguments, either with your inspector, your contractor, your designer, or whomever. Make sure that your debates and arguments are technically accurate and focused. So please take a look at Article 90. It may do you some good. All right. I apologize again for not being live today, but it happens. And hopefully you got something out of this session. And I hope it was worth your time. I know it was worth mine. Thank you for joining in this session today. Thanks for what you do for the electrical industry. Thank you for what you do for electrical safety. Remember to stay safe and please, by all means, stay healthy. See you next week.